Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again in our next presentation in the 27th Annual National Security Law Conference here at Duke Law School. For those of you tuning in from outside, we do have a small group of students here to listen to one of my favorite speakers, and unquestionably one of the most popular speakers that we ever have at our conferences. And he's Mr. Dean Chang. Dean is a very modest person. He wanted me to let you know that he wasn't a lawyer, but actually he is so smart in so many different areas. It's always a fantastic opportunity to hear him speak. And because of things that are happening, he's going to speak about China and various, technologies and so forth. But he's going to focus his presentation this morning on the relationship between China and Russia. And as I'm sure everyone knows, in my blog yesterday, I mentioned that China is opening its doors to Russia to sell all the wheat that Russia can get to them as a way of helping. This is not their words, this is my words. Helping Russia avoid the impact of the sanctions. But this is just one of many things that you'll learn from Dean. He's from the Heritage Foundation. He is one of the most personally respected people I know in the whole national security space, especially inside the Beltway. I know that's a little bit of a slur to say inside the Beltway, but everybody, he has what we used to call in the old days the E.F. Hutton effect, meaning when Dean Chang speaks, everybody listens. And so without further ado, Dean, thank you so much for coming, and we're looking forward to it.
Thank you, General Dunlap, for the opportunity to be here. So I have to be honest, when I was invited to come down and speak here at Duke University, my wife, I had barely finished saying, we're invited to, and she said, yes, we're going. So my comments today are going to be about China-Russia relations, in part because, well, there have been a few developments regarding Russia. But let me first provide some historical overview, which I think is very important in understanding how and where China and Russia started off from in order to get to where we are today. So one of the important things to start with is a recognition that China, in its relations with the great powers, has no allies. China is not allied with Russia today. China has its closest security ties with Pakistan and North Korea. And there is far better argument that there are extensive military ties of long standing between those two countries than between China and Russia. It's also important to recognize the extent to which there have been very mixed relations between China, Russia, and the United States over the last, let's say, 80, 90, 100 years. In particular, we have a Sino-Soviet alliance, a Russo-Chinese relationship, a Sino-Soviet split, and almost comparable type relations between the United States and China. So let's begin very quickly with U.S.-China ties. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. And it's important to recognize that this was intended to reset the strategic environment of the Cold War. It was not about opening up China as some kind of commercial market. It was not some kind of opening to create a massive Chinese economy. The Chinese economy in 1972 was frankly moribund. It was a highly collectivized, highly centralized economy that made a relatively small amount of stuff, certainly in terms of global GDP percentages, that very few people except Chinese wanted to buy. And the only reason the Chinese were buying it was because they didn't have trade relations with anyone. It didn't occur in a vacuum. Two important developments, which I will get to briefly later, are the Sino-Soviet border war of 1969 and the fall of Lin Biao. And the reason why I bring that up now is to say U.S.-China relations have not simply been what did the U.S. want to do and then China went along with it. It was often a function as well of internal Chinese politics and external relations between China and key major powers. So as we look at the span of history over the last 50 years, we see that US-Chinese ties have gone through positive periods and very negative periods. Ironically, some of the closest periods was under Ronald Reagan, who, building atop Nixon's opening to China, established very close military and security ties with a China intended to balance the Soviet Union. We exported entire production lines for certain military munitions to China. We established listening posts in Western China to replace the ones we lost when Iran went under the mullahs. Ironically enough, the Tiananmen massacre created a moment in US-China relations comparable to the Sino-Soviet split. There were projects that were literally half finished that we walked out on. And the Chinese lesson from that is we cannot depend on the Americans, just as we could not depend on the Soviets. And that was partly then reinforced by our expectation in the wake of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union collapsed, that China, of course, and by the way, also North Korea, would also no longer be communist, would no longer be socialist, that there would be a flowering of democracy. Because after all, that's what happened in Europe. Needless to say, again, 30 years later, 35 years later, that is not the actual course of history. Instead, what we have seen in the 21st century is that China's economic growth has led to extensive Chinese military modernization. And I would say here that we should have expected this, because if you think of military capability as insurance, the better off you are, the more insurance you have. For those of you who are currently students, trust me, eventually you will no longer be students. And when you are farther along in your career with home and car and all these sorts of things, you're going to wind up buying more insurance. And that is essentially what we have seen with China. Part of the problem has been that the insurance that China has purchased, in some cases, is much more offensive. And that has gathered, and it is a challenge to China's neighbors, many of whom are our allies. So all of this is indicative of why US-China relations has had ups and downs, as there are periods when we've needed China and when China's needed us. And there have been elements of China's development in our own concerns where relations have become much rockier. And unfortunately, since about 2008, 2009, the general tenor has been downwards, as China has built islands in the South China Sea, harassed US ships and aircraft operating in what they would consider their either exclusive economic zones, which they define differently from UNCLOS, or within what they would consider territorial waters even, and airspace. These are key factors. And by the way, there's an entire legal warfare aspect to that, which I'm happy to talk about during Q&A. What about China-Russia ties? China and Russia actually were historical rivals dating back to the 15th and 16th century. That was during the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, when China was expanding into what is now Turkestan, what is now Xinjiang, etc. These were actually areas that were dominated by the steppe people of various, what had earlier been Mongolian tribes. And they ran into the Russians who were expanding eastward into Siberia. And there was an extensive period in that region of what is now Central Asia where Russian and Chinese interests overlapped. They reached agreements at times, clashed at times, fought for interests. By the late Qing dynasty, the late 19th century, however, Russia was ascendant and China was in decline. And that was when Russia began to sign unequal treaties with China, the same way that Britain and France and even the United States have. With the creation of the Soviet Union in 1919, we see Sino-Soviet relations go through a very interesting period again of great volatility. The Chinese accuse the Soviets of creating Outer Mongolia. That if you look at maps of China dating back to the 19th and 18th centuries, what is now Outer Mongolia was in fact part of China. And that the Soviet Union helped detach Outer Mongolia and make it a quote-unquote independent country which was in fact under the Soviet thumb. And it's interesting to note that the battles in 1938-39 between the Japanese and the Soviets occurred in what is now Outer Mongolia, including Manchu puppet troops of Japan and Mongolian puppet troops of the Soviet Union. The Soviets supported nationalist China against Japan in the run-up to the second phase of World War II when we entered. And Soviet support to Mao during the Chinese Civil War was important, but not quite decisive. In fact, Stalin was one of those who counseled Mao to stop at the Yangtze, allow nationalist China to maintain a rump state in the South, because he did not want Mao to overextend himself. Mao rolled across the Yangtze and drove the nationalist regime to Taiwan, which is part of the root of today's Taiwan crisis. Probably the most commonly referred to aspect these days is the Sino-Soviet split. There were close ties between the newly established People's Republic of China from 1949 through 1960, but a variety of factors led to a fundamental divide and ultimately great hostility between Beijing and Moscow. There was the question of who should succeed Stalin after Stalin died. Mao, being of the same generation, felt, well, I had one of the most populous countries in the world. I'm communist. Stalin is dead. I'm obviously the next leader of the world communist movement. Nikita Khrushchev said, not so fast. I'm a Russian, like Stalin. And the Soviet Union was the creator of socialism, socialist states. I should obviously be in charge. So that was one. Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech, where he detailed Stalin's various crimes, was an enormous shock around the world. And to Mao, this was a betrayal of one of his great heroes, Stalin. There were also border issues that had been sort of papered over, going back to things like Outer Mongolia, things like Russian unequal territorial claims in what is now Siberia. You had the split in '60, and again, the Soviets at that point left literally projects half finished, production lines half built, factories half constructed. Very embittering to the Chinese. From 1960 until the 1980s, this is the period when the Soviets and the Chinese were at their greatest mutual dislike. And this included the 1969 Sino-Soviet border war. And that war is a good example of how differently China, for example, thinks about nuclear deterrence, thinks about crisis stability, because a China that had only recently developed nuclear weapons started a war with their Soviet neighbors who had lots of nuclear weapons. This began in the east, along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, where Chinese forces ambushed Soviet border guards, and the conflict escalated to battalion and regimental-sized battles. There are also battles in the west, in Xinjiang and Kazakhstan, which of course at that time was actually part of the USSR. And so those clashes confirmed to American intelligence analysts that the Sino-Soviet split was not political masquerade, maskirovka, but was real, because there were so many casualties being inflicted on the two sides. And those border clashes helped precipitate the US-China opening. They also ultimately were resolved only in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Mikhail Gorbachev met with Deng Xiaoping and finally hammered out an agreement, which is one of the reasons why, despite all the border tensions you see between China and India, China in the South China Sea, China and Japan, you don't hear much along the Central Asian borders, because they were the inheritors of the agreement between Gorbachev and Deng to resolve those issues. So with the fall of the Soviet Union, we return back to Russia-Chinese relations. And very quickly, under Deng Xiaoping, we saw a slow improvement in ties, especially on the border issues. But what we also saw was a China very focused on the West. Economic development was the centerpiece, and they understood that the Soviets and later the Russians would not be the source of economic development. If anything, under Jiang Zemin, 1992 to 2002, we see instead significant imports of Russian scientific and technological equipment, including space capabilities and military weapons, in no small part because Russia was crippled. Russia was desperately looking for any place that would buy Russian equipment, and there were little fire sales of space-related technologies, for example, to the Chinese. Under Hu Jintao, who took power in 2002, we saw the beginnings of a restructuring of the Chinese-Russian relationship, expanding military sales, expanding resource sales, interestingly expanding economic ties, particularly in the area of oil. We see the Chinese and Russians building pipelines that would link their two networks. We see significant increases in Chinese purchases of oil as China was on its way to becoming the #1 importer of oil from both Central Asia and Russia. So where does that leave us today? In terms of current Chinese-Russia ties, very quickly, let me run through some key areas. One is, of course, economic. China is Russia's largest trade destination, and China is the largest source of Russian imports. What that basically means is that China is Russia's largest trading partner. In 2021, that was $147 billion, and that was up by almost 1/3 from 2020. What are some of the key areas that this involves? Energy, above all. Ongoing Russian oil sales dating back to the mid-2000s. In the early 2000s, the Russians signed a $25 billion 20-year deal. And this has only become more important as Ukraine has become an issue, because beginning with the EU sanctions in around 2014, Russia had fewer places to sell its oil. And China was more than happy to take that up. But it's not just oil. Within the last couple of weeks, China and Russia signed a $100 million coal deal. 100 million ton. So the reason why this matters is twofold. One, it's indicative that China is going to continue to rely on coal. And given that China is one of the world's largest coal producers, it's interesting that they would choose nonetheless to sign a deal with Russia now to purchase coal. Like the wheat deal that Joan Dunlap mentioned earlier, these are political sales as much as they are economic sales. Food is another key area. China is a net importer of food. And while you can substitute to some extent among energy sources, China imports every one of its staple grains: wheat, sorghum, rye, corn, rice. So there's not much trade space when you're importing across all of those elements. And Russia, as well as Ukraine, are both major food exporting nations with significant amounts of staple grains among the portfolio that they sell. And obviously, if you import from Russia, you're not importing from the United States, Canada, and Australia, which have been traditionally larger sources of staple grains. Finally, telecom. It is interesting to note that Huawei has been permitted by Putin to build Russia's 5G network, and this was agreed in 2019. So this provides an indication that there is no question that the Russians and Chinese don't trust each other, but Russia doesn't have the technological capacity very clearly to build a 5G network on its own, and has chosen in that situation to nonetheless rely on the Chinese. Politically, we see a variety of cooperation between Beijing and Moscow. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, established in 2001. This is a group of 8 original signatories and a number of additional ones. It includes the Central Asian republics, so China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, along with observer states, Afghanistan, Belarus, Iran, and Mongolia, and then dialogue partners. Interestingly, these are also countries that have agreed to engage in certain joint military exercises. And as an indication of the evolution in political and economic power, Beijing wanted the agreement originally to be signed in Beijing. And Russia said, absolutely not. And so it was signed in Shanghai to send, again, a political signal that this was not going to necessarily be dominated by China. And as it has evolved, the Russians have a pretty full partnership, arguably in excess of any of the Central Asian republics. China and Russia have also interestingly coordinated at the UN. Of about 17 Chinese vetoes ever cast, 10 have been about Syria, not about Taiwan, not about Taiwan recognition, which was in some cases such as the Chinese vetoing the admission of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia because they recognized Taiwan. But China has cast the greatest number of votes on behalf of the Syrian government, often in cases where Russia had already cast a veto. And this, again, is an interesting political signal of both cooperation between these two countries, and as important, the emphasis on quote-unquote sovereignty issues, because in each case, the veto was about whether the UN would authorize intervention or condemnation of the Assad government, whether it was over use of chemical weapons or human rights violations. Finally, China and Russia, this goes back to the previous panel, have cooperated with regards to space and space law. They have jointly submitted multiple times efforts to oppose the deployment of weapons in outer space at various UN disarmament conferences in Geneva, as both Russia and China have admitted when sometimes they get questioned on this, this treaty proposed would not in fact stop any of the current Russian or Chinese space weapons developments, because those are for the most part ground-based. So therefore wouldn't fall under these. But it is about preventing the deployment of quote-unquote deployment of weapons in outer space. Space is a key potential domain for future conflict in the eyes of both Moscow and Beijing. And so this is an interesting aspect of the coordination on legal warfare terms against the West. Let me conclude then with a quick observation about military ties. We see significant arms sales from Russia to China. This has included submarines, helicopters, advanced surface-to-air missiles, key weapons parts that China cannot yet make, in particular fighter aircraft turbofan engines. They've conducted a lot of joint military exercises. These have grown in scope. China's first foreign military exercise as a foreign military country was Peace Mission 2005, conducted through the auspices of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was a counterterrorism operation that included China's surface fleet and large use of heavy bombers, usually not considered counter-terrorist weapons. And that was in 2005. Since then, we have seen Chinese and Russian forces cooperate, including in the major Russian Vostok exercises in 2018, and West Joint 2021, which was held in Western China. Now, these exercises are important, one, because they are political signals, again. They show that these two major military powers cooperate together. Two, we see an interesting growth in the scale in terms of more joint operations together. West Joint 2021 saw Russian Army soldiers coming out the back of Chinese armored personnel carriers. To give you an idea of how extraordinary this is, NATO, of course, which has been around for quite a long time, does not have British soldiers coming out the back of German armored personnel carriers, or us coming out the back of Dutch armored personnel carriers. That is a level of integration that is more extensive, at least that's the message they're trying to send. Do we think that the Russians and Chinese are actually that joint, that cooperative? No. But it is, again, interesting that on state-run media from Russia, this would be an image they would choose to send out. What is important to note is that it is often noted that China hasn't fought a war since 1979, and therefore does not have actual combat experience, which is true. But Chinese forces are cooperating with Russian forces who do have extensive combat experience, whether in Georgia, whether in eastern Ukraine, now across Ukraine, whether in Chechnya. So it is an interesting question what Chinese military forces might have learned from their Russian counterparts over the course of these increasingly extensive exercises of the last 17, 18 years. I don't want to give people the impression that all is well in the Chinese-Russian relationship. There are tensions. When we look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative maps, there's no investment, at least under BRI, in Russia. And Russia could use infrastructure. It could use new railroads. It could use paved roads. It could use a lot of infrastructure development east of the Petersburg-Moscow line. Instead, Chinese BRI initiatives, investments all head west into Central Asia and then southwest towards Iran, towards the Mediterranean, towards the Caucasus, and then westward. In Kazakhstan, earlier this year, we saw what was an interesting potential conflict of interest. As protests occurred in Kazakhstan, Russia sent in troops, and China went from saying, we are concerned and we express our political support for the current government in Kazakhstan, to offering to send in security forces. It would appear that there is at least some competition that is sharpening now between Moscow and Beijing over who should really dominate the various Central Asian republics, who were, of course, all former Soviet states. What does this imply for the future, especially with regards to law and security? Both Russia and China engage in political warfare. This is a key part of both countries' arsenals and portfolios. Both of them see this as the war before the war. Political warfare is constantly undertaken because it undermines and influences adversary populations. The Russians and the Chinese have very different lines of effort. The Russians tend more towards sowing chaos, creating confusion. They will support right-wing parties in one country and left-wing parties in another country and anarchists in a third, mostly just to create a lot of confusion. The Chinese are different. Their doctrine regarding political warfare is embodied in what they term the three warfares. Legal warfare being a key part, but also public opinion warfare and psychological warfare. What is worrisome is we are starting to see cross-fertilization between these two. We are starting to see the Chinese take a greater and greater interest in disrupting immediate, short-term political campaigns. Not clear in the United States how much that has occurred, very extensively documented in Australia and New Zealand. We see the Russians, meanwhile, taking, in some cases, a longer-term approach, buying influence, building up the dossiers on various civil society groups, and working to establish longer-term ties, not just creating confusion. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, we have seen a lot of the efforts to suborn the local population, a little bit along the Chinese side. We have seen cyber warfare attacks that are going to set legal precedents. And here I want to say that I am confident that the Chinese are very closely watching international reaction, not just at a technical level to Russian cyber warfare attacks, but also what is the legal response to that. Because Russia, in attacking Ukraine, has done something that neither we nor the Chinese nor the Russians have done in peacetime, and that is destroy data. If you take a look, the destruction of data has been something conducted by North Korea and by Iran. North Korea with the Sony hacks, Iran with the Shamoon attacks and other attacks on Saudi computer systems. You will have a very gray area with ransomware because the data isn't destroyed, it's just inaccessible. But this so-called Wiper program has attacked Ukrainian computers and actually destroyed the data. So what kind of legal, in addition to technical recourse, what kind of military response that will engender is something that I have no doubt Beijing is closely watching to see whether or not it will have more wiggle room should it decide to move against Taiwan. Let me close with, in addition to the cross-fertilization, we should expect to see, therefore, China, which has deeper pockets, arguably more advanced technology, expanding on Russian methods and lessons across a wider variety of players because of its extensive economic integration into global supply chains. So let me close there by thanking again Duke and Professor Dunlap for the opportunity to be here today and open up to questions.
If you have a question for Mr. Cheng, please, for the audience here, please come down and come to the microphone. And what I'd like to do, Dean, is to open up with a couple of questions of my own. And one would be, one of the things that surprised me about the Russian Ukraine is that they brought their Far Eastern armies. And in other words, not only did they remove them, but now we know they're actually putting them in harm's way and they'll have to be refitted and so forth. Is the relationship really that close that they could have that kind of confidence? It doesn't seem that way looking back at history.
So I think that when the Russians pulled forces out of their Far Eastern command structure and moved them to the West, it sent what was, I think, intentionally a political signal addressing exactly that question. That this is not, in a sense, your father-Sino-Soviet relationship. This Western idea that inevitably, and sooner rather than later, you will have a revived Sino-Soviet Russian-Chinese split is not going to necessarily happen. And is it clear that the Chinese would jump through this window of opportunity? No, because I don't think that the Chinese are necessarily looking for a war, and they're simply saying, well, who's up on the menu? I could take Taiwan or I could take Eastern Russia. Let's roll the dice. I think that there is confidence in Moscow that the Chinese probably aren't going to do that in any case, but it is like West Joint 2021, where the military forces are cooperating that closely. It is a huge, huge political signal. And it goes with the sale of grain from Russia to China. It goes with the sale of coal from Russia to China. It goes with Chinese announcements of investments in Russia, that, especially in the energy sector, that goes to saying, and most recently, of course, I think it was like yesterday, where the Chinese Foreign Ministry basically said, we're not going to condemn Russia. And in fact, if anything, America is partly responsible for the situation in Ukraine. So military confidence, yes and no. The Chinese military also does not think of itself quite ready to start the next phase of warfare, especially aimed at Taiwan, but presumably against Russia. And Russia does have nuclear weapons. So there is always the underlying nuclear deterrent aspect.
Let me follow up with kind of a related question. How much technology transfer do you think there is between Russia and China? And maybe taking a step further, could you see them like collaborating on cyber operations?
So that's a good question. It's hard to answer. It's hard to answer in part because both Russia and China are not exactly transparent, and in part because we have seen such a massive shift in the relative technological advances of the two countries. One of Russia's primary exports back in the Soviet days was machine tools, especially within the East Bloc. Today, Russian machine tools have a very limited market, mostly to very poor countries. China has displaced it in terms of producing both high-quality machine tools and inexpensive machine tools. So where we do see technological cooperation is in certain areas such as space. China and Russia have announced that they're going to cooperate in a lunar program. Not necessarily a human landing, but probably some kind of lunar orbiting facility similar to Lunar Gateway that the US is going to lead without the Russians. Pharmaceuticals, advanced materials, things like that, we don't see much in the way, at least publicly, of cooperation. Here, China seems to dominate. With regards to cyber, this is a personal opinion, I don't think either country is about to allow the other access to their most classified programs. There probably is some amount of sharing in terms of when each detects viruses, but even there, how much cooperate. Now, one of the interesting things about that is Kaspersky Labs, major purveyor of antiviral software, which has been identified as having ties to the federal, to the FSB, the successor to the KGB. Some of their programs have been tested and apparently do not respond to Chinese viruses. Now, it could be that they haven't caught up. But there seems to be a pattern, and I want to emphasize seems to be a pattern, where perhaps Russian antivirus software that is exported doesn't necessarily go after Chinese viruses. There doesn't seem to have been many exports of Chinese antivirus software. I have visited an antivirus software company in Beijing. They highlighted Vietnamese intrusions. They didn't talk much about, and Western intrusions, but they didn't talk much about Russian intrusions.
We have a question from student, Gabby?
Thanks so much for being here. This is a really interesting talk. I'm curious, you just sort of alluded to it in one of your answers to General Dunlap and at the end of your talk, but I'm wondering if you could expand a bit more on whether you think, sort of based on the West's reaction and response to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, whether you think that would empower China to invade Taiwan in the near future, or what you think their thinking would be on that.
That's a question that has been on many people's minds. So what I would say is the following. First, I think China does have a timetable for eventually reunifying China and Taiwan by peaceful means if possible, by force if necessary. The PLA plays a key part in the second one. By its own assessments, they keep emphasizing, and this is pre-Ukraine, that they expect to be fully modernized, and they have a definition for that, by 2027. What is the definition? Fully mechanized, fully informationized, and now fully intelligenceized. Fully mechanized because a chunk of the PLA is still actually leg infantry. They go to war either literally by marching or getting in trucks. They are trying to make sure that every Chinese unit is mechanized, meaning tracked or at least armored combat vehicles, not deuce and hands. Fully informationized. When you watch PLA Day parades in Beijing, you see some very interesting equipment. You see airborne early warning platforms. You see electronic warfare units. You see ground-based radars. Not every Chinese unit is at that level. Some units have UAVs and computer virus units and all the rest. And some are, again, just as some guys are marching to war, some of the units are not there yet. Finally, this last part, the intelligence-ized part. China is emphatically investing in artificial intelligence, big computing. They want their weapons to be able to talk to each other. Think of it as a militarized Internet of Things. Again, the very most elite units have that. There's a lot of units that aren't there yet. So before 2027, like right now, could China take advantage of our distraction and go after Taiwan? In theory, yes. But remember, this is a war, even more than Ukraine for Putin. China has to win because the leadership will probably not survive if they lose. So we have a window of opportunity as American and other forces are sort of sucked off to Europe. But Europe, of course, is not a naval campaign region very much. We're not about to sail the Stennis or the Reagan into the Black Sea. So there's a fair amount of assets still available to help deter China for now. But absolutely, the Chinese are watching several things. One, how do drones operate in today's world? Can they operate in a fairly highly intense air defense environment, electronic warfare environment? Two, what are casualty rates? Is modern warfare truly Stalingrad with better weapons, or is it lower casualties? The Russians supposedly, according to press reports, suffered about 350 casualties yesterday across all of the Ukraine fronts. 350 casualties would be roughly probably 3 blocks worth of dead in a bad week in Stalingrad. It is more extensive, arguably, than what we suffered in one day during all of the Fallujah campaigns. So the Chinese are going to be looking at that to assess casualties, weapons effectiveness, weapons expenditure rates. And then finally, politically, if we and Germany and Italy will not boot Russia, whose economy is about the size of Italy's, off of SWIFT over an open invasion of a country in violation of the Helsinki Accords as well as Minsk II, What is the likelihood that anyone will try to boot China off of SWIFT over a small island that nobody recognizes diplomatically as a country at all? So I think all of these are factors that Beijing is applying.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
I think we have maybe time for one more. Let me ask you this. You, I guess 10 years ago now, you wrote the seminal piece on three warfares and legal warfare. If you could just do a retrospective of where China was then and where they are now and where you think they might be going.
So the three warfares are public opinion warfare, altering and shifting people's views of a given situation, in this case, China. It is constant and ongoing. That was true 10 years ago. That's more true today. 10 years ago, they were purchasing access to global media. Today, they run global media, Xinhua globally, CGTN globally, but also their ability to influence reporters. Bloomberg killed stories about corruption in China because if they had pursued those stories, they were told, you'll be booted out of China. And Bloomberg, as a financial reporting system, wanted to maintain that access. Psychological warfare. 10 years ago, we were talking about how the Chinese are going to try and influence leaders around the world. It's been fascinating to watch the THAAD case in South Korea, how China used weaponized tourism, economic pressure on Lotte, driving it out of China, and a variety of investment in other plays to get the South Korean president, President Moon, whose term ends in a couple of weeks, to basically commit South Korea to not deploying any more THAAD, not joining Japan in a regional missile defense capacity, and not joining Japan and the United States in forming a trilateral alliance. He was willing to go that far, largely because of psychological aspects. And finally, legal warfare. And legal warfare has been interesting because we are watching it play out across a variety of methods in the South China Sea, in space, in commercial law. We saw, for example, the recent effort to end the DOJ's China initiative, which was driven by American factors, but is an example of legal warfare of influencing our own law enforcement agencies and legal and regulatory bodies to shift and accommodate what the Chinese would prefer. And make no mistake, I'm not suggesting that the people who are pushing this are somehow Chinese agents, but when you look at the list of demands presented to Wendy Sherman, Deputy Secretary of State, and to John Kerry, and to Antony Blinken, those demands included essentially an end to the DOJ's China initiative.
Well, Dean, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you again. It was, every time I hear you speak, I learn a lot. Every time I read your writing, I learn a lot. And it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much.